We are ready to start. Thank you for participating in this webinar series lecture hosted by the Graduate School of Education's Global Education Office at Kyoto University. My name is Takamatsu and I will be moderating today's session. It's nice to meet you. This year's theme is the future of Japanese-style education in the age of diversity. We have been focusing on the presence of diversity in Japan and considering whether it is possible to meet the needs of diverse children while taking advantage of the strengths of Japanese-style education. For the sixth lecture, Dr. Kosuke Sato of the Department of Psychology, Faculty of Letters, Kurume University will give a presentation on the topic. The title of their talk is Japanese Resistant Reaction to Inclusion of People with Disabilities, a Social Psychological Approach with Quantitative Data. Thank you very much for your time, Sato-san. As I was introduced, I'm Sato. Today I would like to make a presentation titled Japanese Resistant Reaction to the Inclusion of People with Disabilities, a Social Psychological Approach with Quantitative Data. As I've been introduced, we are meeting online today, and I hope you can get some idea of why I'm doing the research that I do. So let me briefly introduce myself. I started out studying clinical psychology, but I wanted to learn more about the influence of the environment and the society, so I joined the social psychology lab at Hokkaido University. Perhaps my perspective was a bit biased, but at the time, I had the impression that clinical psychology didn't have much of a social dimension, and also that both theory and practice were weak with respect to diversity. That was one of the reasons I entered the graduate school of Hokkaido University. After that, I started my career at the Center for Experimental Research in Social Sciences at Hokkaido University. In clinical psychology, the scientist practitioner model is recommended. And I thought, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. So while conducting research, I also practice as a school counselor and at a psychiatric emergency information center where patients with mental disorders are triaged. Perhaps that is why I was appointed to a position in the Office for Students and Persons with Disabilities at Nagoya University, where I finished my tenure and moved to Kochi University, where I have been supporting students with disabilities for about 8 years. After that, I decided to put a little bit more weight on research. So I started working at Kurume University 2 years ago. So the information in red is about my background in research on disabilities. As I will talk about it a little bit later, if disability is defined by the interaction between the individual and the environment, and if the environmental side has to be improved, then social psychology is exactly the field of study for that approach. I'm considering making this study of disability my life's work because it fits well with the research I have been working on. By the way, the picture on the right is a picture of fish because I like fishing. This is the outline of today's research introduction. One of my objectives is to accumulate evidence on the situation in which people with disabilities are surrounded, especially on the quantitative aspects. Today, we will review some of the difficult situations in which people with disabilities are surrounded. I will also share with you some of the difficulties in promoting inclusive education systems, which I believe are more relevant to this webinar series. These research findings have been presented in various places, and maybe there are some people who are familiar with them, but it would be great if you can keep me company. First is study number 1. The study was done with Dr. Goto of Fukuyama City University. People's perception of reasonable accommodation is one of the core factors for accommodating people with disabilities, and this study looked at people's perceptions of it. Before introducing this study, I suppose most of the audience here are familiar with it, but just in case you don't know, I would like to explain about disability and reasonable accommodation. In the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, simply put, a disability is defined as a condition of being in a disabled state. In Japanese, the term disability is also used in the term impairment or functional impairment, so it's a bit complicated, but in other words, the patient must have impairments in the medical terminology sense, and they must be facing social barriers in the environment. On top of that, there must be a disabled condition which will be defined as a disability. Reasonable accommodation is the removal of the social barriers or adjustment of the environment. Please take a look at the chart on the bottom left. Functional limitations, as I like to call them, affect social adaptation, and social barriers regulate that relationship. With or without social barriers, the impact of functional limitations on social adaptation can be stronger or weaker. Therefore, as shown in the lower right chart, reasonable accommodations and preemptive remedial measures, which are the removal of social barriers in advance, are necessary to restore the low level of social adaptation opportunity to an equitable level. The blue line shows the case of people without functional limitations, assuming that there's no significant impact whether social barriers are present or not. The orange line is for people with functional limitations, where the presence of barriers greatly reduces both opportunities and adaptation. Reasonable accommodation is an attempt to improve this situation by working on the environment. As a side note, both Nagoya University and Kochi University are discussing this kind of issue at their on-campus faculty development sessions. At Nagoya University, I worked around faculty development in each department for about 2 rounds, and the teachers who understood this discussion most immediately were those in the agriculture department. Since we are talking about ecology, I said individual differences affect inclusive fitness, but it is naturally adjusted by the environment, right? Improving the relevant environment rather than working on the individual is called reasonable accommodation. And when I tell them that, they really get it right away. There were different reactions in different departments, so I learned a lot from it. As another side note, there is a group called PepNet Japan, where people who are deaf or hard of hearing gather. I have attended a few times, and people who can sign get together there. I don't sign, but everyone there thinks I do, and they all sign to me. In such an environment, I need a sign language interpreter, or perhaps I should say a language interpreter, or I need to communicate with them in writing. I really felt that disability depends on the environment. Now I'm going to move on to my research. This research was done by Lancers, which is a crowdsourcing crowdsourcing service. It's from 2017, which is a few years ago, and it was conducted exactly 1 year after the Act for Eliminating Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities. And this is going to be revised in 2024. So if we win research funding, we would like to conduct a similar study. And not only this study, but the study I am presenting today does not ensure the representativeness of the samples. So I would like to ask you to assume that there's some kind of bias in the samples. There are more than 1,000 samples. As for the results, we ask things like, have you ever heard of reasonable accommodation? Do you know what reasonable accommodation means? Do you understand what reasonable accommodation is? The more you ask these questions, the more the number of samples will drop off. The final result was that 80 out of, or 7% indicated that they understood reasonable accommodation. It's been 5 years since this wordage has come out, so there may be more people now. And then, although it was a bit mean, we asked them to write freely about reasonable accommodation to see if they really understood it. As a result of text mining, the most common words used were those related to helping. Therefore, since reasonable accommodation is not helping or assistance, the number of respondents who understood it was quite small in this data set. And the understanding of many of those who said they understand it was also questionable. The Japanese translation of the word means consideration, so I guess that's how people would generally understand it. Now that 5 years have passed since this survey, I would like to think that the word has reached a larger crowd to some extent, but I'm not sure. Next, this is study 2. I would like to introduce a survey on the well-being of people with disabilities. This is also a web-based survey that was commissioned by a marketing company. It was actually not a survey towards people with disabilities, but a survey conducted for another study on people's well-being and environmental factors. We only did regional and gender segmentation. But when we looked at the presence or absence of disabilities as a question, it was kind of like a side question. We found that about 10% of the respondents were people with disabilities. This marketing firm frequently undertakes academic surveys. So in a survey like this, whether or not the respondent has a disability must be taken into account as a systemic factor. It would be better to ask about their disability status and control the results, for example. The WHO estimate of people with disabilities is about 15%. And we have asked many times, not only through questions from this company, but with others as well. And of course, this isn't representative, but between 7% and 10% of the respondents report some kind of disability.
And the way we ask the respondents about disability is indicated in red on the slide. And this survey does not take into account the degree, type, or individuality of disabilities. And the measurements used in the survey Referred to as socio-ecological factors are relational mobility, which is the number of opportunities to form interpersonal relationships that exist in the relevant society, and also some individual factors. So it's the individual factors include the degree of interpersonal relationship fluidity, self-esteem, satisfaction with life, satisfaction with family and friends, quality of life, the big five personality traits, as well as age, gender, and personal income. And these are the results. First, there was no difference in the perception of relationship building opportunities present in the environment between individuals without disabilities. So the blue is for the people with disabilities and orange is with the people without disabilities. And so there were no difference in the perception, but there were differences in the opportunities for individuals, with the results being lower for people with disabilities. This is the result for quality of life. And it was also lower for people with disabilities. And on the left, you see self-esteem, satisfaction with life, and satisfaction with family and friends. And for all three factors, they were significantly lower for people with disabilities as well. And regarding the big five personality traits, differences were found in extroversion, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. The people with disabilities show lower levels of extroversion and conscientiousness and higher levels of neuroticism. In addition, I will report the results of the analysis of variance for these well-being indicators for men and women and for the presence or absence of disability. The results presented below all show significant interaction effects, with women with disabilities being lower on all. While there are a number of intersectionality issues, including disability in women, disability in poverty, disability in sexual minorities, and disability in regions, the results suggest that an intersectionality of disability in women is a concern. On the left is racial mobility, which is the opportunity of building relationships within an environment. And women have the lowest self-racial mobility, suggesting that women with disabilities may have fewer opportunities to form relationships. And the same goes for quality of life. And also for satisfaction with family and friends. And this is for personal income. And perhaps female have lower rates. And so there are researchers studying about women and disabilities, but I think my impression is that not much research has been done, especially for the issue of intersectionality. And now here's a study that compares the same matter in the US and Japan. This is a study with Dr. Joanna Shug of College of William and Mary. We've done a similar research. We recruited survey collaborators through a company called Cross Marketing in Japan and MTurk and Turk Prime in the US. It is a fairly large sample size with 721 Japanese people with disabilities and 668 American people with disabilities. The measurements are almost the same as in the previous survey, but some of the measures which are written in red have been added. And the BBC SWB is a scale for quality of life. There's also a social support scale and other scales as well. And now let me show you the results. Basically, the well-being of Americans is way higher than that of the Japanese. And in both Japan and the US, when we compare people with disabilities to people without disabilities, we find that well-being of people without disabilities is higher than that of people with disabilities. And that depending on the scale, there are quite a few American people with disabilities who experience higher levels of well-being than people without disabilities in Japan. On the left is relational mobility, which is the opportunity to form interpersonal relationships in the environment. And there's no difference between people with and without disabilities. But in the self-relational mobility on the right, people with disabilities in both Japan and the US have lower levels. However, the pattern of self-mobility is higher for Americans with disabilities than for Japanese without disabilities. So with this pattern in mind, this will come up a lot. Let's take a look at the results. So the same applies to self-esteem. The presence of disability and the main effect of the country are significant. So the orange, if you look at the orange, you'll see the Americans have a higher rate. And the same results apply to life, satisfaction, and quality of life. And this is for loneliness. So on the contrary, loneliness is higher for people with disabilities in both the US and Japan. Although the differences are small, loneliness is higher among people with disabilities in the US than among Japanese people with disabilities. So with other scales, you'll see quality of life higher, but I feel like the loneliness is higher in both people. This is the result for social support and satisfaction with interpersonal relationships. And you see the same pattern here. This is personal income. So the reason why there does not seem to be much difference is that we do not break the data down by gender. When we look at men and women separately, we can see the same interaction effects as before, both in Japan and the US. And this is extroversion. So although it's shown to be lower in both countries for people with disabilities, but there are no significant differences in the country, both countries, and well-being was also low for people with disabilities, especially the scores of people with disabilities in Japan. People in the US who are doing disabilities research said that inclusion in the US can still be a challenge, and that even in the academic realm, there are still issues to be addressed. However, I still think that inclusion of people with disability is more advanced in the US, and perhaps we can consider the results as a reflection of such a situation. Although mobility may be a challenge, the greater number of opportunities to form interpersonal relationships creates other opportunities. And the US may be better off in that there are still some more opportunities than being isolated in a closed environment. And the following study 4 to 6 relate to inclusive education. I do system-related inclusive education research with Professor Maeda from Rikkyo University and Professor Hashimoto from Osaka Metropolitan University. I also recently joined them in researching the help mark symbol. In the agenda for this session, I wrote if I had time, I will also talk about the research about help mark symbol, but I guess I won't have time today. And for this help mark symbol research, we were able to receive support from the Osaka Metro, and we will be implementing a social experiment project to see the effectiveness of help mark posters. And I think we are a great research team, and I'm inspired by them and enjoy working with them a lot. And as some of you may know, last September, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities issued a recommendation to Japan. The title of the Yahoo News article is UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities recommends suspension of special needs education, promotes inclusive education. In response to this, the current Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, Keiko Nagaoka, said, "We are not considering discontinuing special support for students in diverse learning environments. While maintaining the current education system, we will continue to promote an inclusive education system in the light of the recommendations." However, I must admit that the minister's comment feels a bit confusing. As you can see in the slide, the number of special needs schools, special needs classes, and also the number of students attending both special needs and regular classes are rising. And I'm not sure if the minister is promoting inclusive education or not. And it's unclear whether the minister is going to continue to promote special needs education, whether they're going to promote segregated education, which Japan was advised against by the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And before we get sidetracked, we'll get back to the research topic. I looked at the comments on this Yahoo article, and I'm sure you're thinking, but people commenting on Yahoo News are not good. And we don't know what kind of people they are either, so we think this is a fairly biased sampling. But in case you're wondering, Yahoo News is the most viewed online news site in Japan. And the response to the news was significant as far as the number of comments. So we collected and checked the comments. And after 24 hours since the article was posted, we collected the data. And there were around 3,000 comments, and we analyzed that.
We checked the number of likes and dislikes. I don't really know about social media, and I don't know, but there's that place to press the button of likes and dislikes, and the number of comments for the comments. We analyze those things. And this was part of a graduation research for Koki Kitajima, a student in my seminar. And so they coded whether people agreed or disagreed. Uh, there are certain people who also show their position, like I am a person with disabilities. And then we also saw what those people thought. And so these are the results. This is the results. It's very clear. 72% disagreed with the recommendation, and just under 2% agreed. And the remaining 10% were undecided or indiscernible, such as opinions that are saying the UN should not interfere in internal affairs or that the outside world is bothersome. Next, some of the commenters specified their positions in their comments. For example, that they are family members of those with disabilities, people who said they had been with people with disabilities at schools, people with disabilities, teachers at special needs schools and classes, and people who identify themselves as teachers, although we do not know what they teach. And we found that the comments were overwhelmingly against the recommendation. And in terms of the likes and dislikes, there were 149,000 likes for 2,521 opposing views, while there were 527 likes for 62 supporting views. And there were 9,508 negative votes for given to those who disagreed with the recommendation, and 521 negative votes for those who disagreed with it. Both in terms of the size of the response and the number of likes, the opposing view was overwhelmingly supported. Of course, there's the issue of the sample, but in terms of the Yahoo comment, these are the results that we found. In study 5, I report on research findings in which people sampled in a different way were asked about their approval or disapproval of segregated and inclusive education. This study examines the perceived desirability and feasibility of 3 types of educational systems: segregated, integrated, and inclusive education. The emphasis is that we are asking the opinions of people with disabilities and teachers as well. Our research team seeks to get a good grasp of the opinions of people with disabilities. It's difficult to gather these kinds of samples, but we try to get their opinions as much as possible. This is a text that we showed to the sample respondents. Segregated education distinguishes children with or without disability and type of impairments, and children with special needs are educated in special needs schools and not in ordinary schools. This is defined as, or we propose this as segregated education. It's based on official documents. And then with integrated education, it distinguishes children with or without disability and type of impairment, and children with special needs are educated by being integrated into schools or classrooms as in general education settings. In inclusive education, regardless of whether children are with or without disability, all are educated in education settings created equally and comprehensively where they learn together. So with this, we asked the respondents about the appropriateness, desirability, approval, and realisticness of these three educational systems based on a 7-point system. And these are the specific questions that we proposed. Since the correlations between the first three were very strong, we took the average of these three together to obtain a desirability score. And the one in blue at the end, we assessed it as the overall feasibility. Here are the samples, here are the results. So right now I'm showing you the samples of both university students and adults. The pattern is the same, where desirability towards segregated education on the left is the highest. It's that blue bar. They both believe that segregated education is desirable. And the right orange bar, at the very right side, indicates how the feasibility of inclusive education is low. To make things easy to understand, I've made 4 out of 7 as 0 in this chart. And so it's lower than the average. These are the results for elementary and junior high school teachers. The desirability for segregated and inclusive education are the same, the blue bar. But you see that they are skeptical about the feasibility of inclusive education. The orange bar is on the lower end. These are the results for people with disabilities. Although it appears that segregated education has a higher score than inclusive education, the blue bar, if my memory serves correct, there wasn't a huge difference, but I'm not quite sure. Either way, their opinion is close to the midpoint. So we see that they fall in a kind of gray area. Yeah, because it's the midpoint, we do see a distinction compared to other samples. Comparing the 4 charts like this, it's clear that those except for people with disabilities are quite in favor of segregated education. On the other hand, adults, including university students, view the feasibility of inclusive education as low. And teachers and people with disabilities, the 2 bottom charts, are skeptical towards it. So we also compared the results with other countries. So this is study 6. The countries are Japan, the UK, the US, and Australia. All the other countries are said to be more progressive in terms of inclusion of people with disabilities. In terms of the number of people, it's roughly around 300 people. There's a bit more Japanese people. We conducted this online and we asked cross marketing to help us. And the questions, because we translated them into English, there are slight differences in the questions. In terms of taking compatibility in Japanese and English, we had to change it slightly, but in terms of the content, it's basically the same. So we're saying that it's the same kind of research. And here are the results. So this is the desirability. And people, this is the left is about the desirability of segregated education. People in Japan tend to be more in favor of segregated education compared to other countries. And you can see they're in the middle. And in terms of the desirability for inclusive education, Japan is lower compared to other countries. This is about the feasibility of segregated education. We included this because of study 5. Oh, sorry, I meant the desirability. No, this is okay. I think this is an odd question, but in terms of the research, we had to ask this, so we're introducing the results. But some international respondents may not have understood the question, even with Japanese people. So I don't consider the left chart that important. The one that's more important is on the right about inclusive education's feasibility. Compared to other countries that are more progressive, the scores weren't very high either. But in terms of the statistics, Japan was the lowest. It's easy to imagine that there are a lot of social barriers in the situation surrounding people with disabilities. And we were able to see that quantitatively, or at least glimpses of it. These could be more serious given the intersectionality of disabilities. In the second half of this presentation, I have shown, among other things, the impact of these social barriers on people's understanding and beliefs about disability, the high level of agreement with segregated education, and the low feasibility of inclusive education. This
And this
seems to cast a
pretty serious shadow
serious
over the promotion of inclusive education. That is my impression. And I introduced several well-known theories and concepts here on the slide. And that suggests possibility that the beliefs of people we have shown in this study that segregated education is desirable will foster and maintain a segregated educational environment, and that the people with disabilities who live there will also believe that such a segregated education environment is desirable for them. And maybe some of them will fight for other opportunities, and they might experience that they won't be able to, the low desirability of that happening. But if people's beliefs and the environment created by them complement each other and lead to stronger social barriers, and again lead to stronger social barriers, I think it seems that promoting an inclusive education system is not a simple matter. So I've been working as a school counselor. At the time I was working at elementary schools and junior high schools, and one of the teachers came up to me and they were saying, I think a student has some kind of issue in following up with the classes. Of course, the teacher just can't say, I think the child has a difficulty or some kind of disability. And in that case, I will have to be the one to tell the parents. No, the teachers are very busy with their job, having a lot of work on their plate. But I also think, and also it is the case that the school doesn't have enough of resources, and one of the teachers has to work and actually talk to the parents and suggest for their child to go to a special needs education school, and also to suggest for them to let the child go through some kind of test or examination. And for the special needs school, you have to apply in a very early stage, or there will be no spot for that child. So the parents will have to decide very quickly in a very early stage. I was in Sapporo, and I had to really tell the parents that they need to decide soon. And I thought we were going through this very in a situation where we're not thinking about inclusion. I'm surprised that there's a lot of time left, but I like to wrap up my presentation.